Keep your $2. The woman said when Elias Vane laid the coins on the auction block and told the town she was leaving with him. No one laughed after that. The noon heat had already wrung the humor out of Dry Hollow. Dust lay over the street like flour over a butcher's board, and the boards under the crowd's boots groaned as if the town itself disliked what it was being made to witness. A fly worried the corner of the clerk's mouth. Somewhere behind the livery, a mule kicked once against a stall and then went still. The woman stood on the platform with her wrists tied in front of her, chin lifted, dark hair pasted to one cheek by sweat. Her dress had once been blue. Now it looked the color of old smoke. She was young, though the hard set of her mouth belonged to someone who had already buried too many people. A bruise marked the line of her jaw. Another dark bloom hid under the cuff of rope at her wrists. The clerk swallowed and tapped the ledger with a nicotine-stained finger. "Debt settlement is lawful," he muttered, as if saying it softer would make it cleaner. "Property to be transferred for labor term until obligations are satisfied." "She ain't property," Elias said. His voice was low, but it carried. Maybe because he was a blacksmith and men were used to listening when he spoke over the clang of iron. Maybe because he almost never wasted words, and in a place like Dry Hollow, silence had its own reputation. He stood at the edge of the platform in his work shirt, sleeves rolled past scarred forearms, a smear of soot still across one hand. He had come from the forge without even wiping clean. Heat still clung to him like a second coat, smelling of coal smoke and scorched metal. Across the platform, Silas Grinn smiled without warmth. Grinn wore a pale suit despite the heat, the collar sharp enough to cut. Dust never seemed to settle on him, which made folks mistrust him even when they took his money. His hat brim threw a knife-thin shadow over eyes that never changed, not in laughter, not in anger, not when cattle prices rose, not when men disappeared. "She signed her father's debt," Grinn said. Town witnessed it. The woman's gaze did not leave Elias. "I signed for burial money. Not this." A stir moved through the crowd, small and uneasy. Everyone in Dry Hollow knew her father had died 3 nights earlier. Jonah Reed had been a horse doctor, part trader, part tracker, the kind of man who could calm a kicked stallion with 2 fingers at its jaw. Folks had brought him animals from 3 counties. Then fever took him fast, and Grinn produced papers before the grave dirt settled. Elias climbed the platform without asking leave. The boards creaked under his boots. "How much?" Grinn's smile widened. "You bidding for labor?" "I'm ending it." The clerk blinked. "Debt stands at $2 and funeral fees." Before Grinn could speak again, Elias set 2 silver dollars on the ledger. They flashed in the sun like cold eyes. A child near the saloon whispered, "That all?" It was $2. Less than the price of a saddle blanket. Less than a month of whiskey tabs. Less than the lie of lawful cruelty parading his order. Grinn's jaw hardened. "That debt includes interest." "Not on the paper," Elias said. The clerk looked down. His lips moved as he reread what was written and what had been left unwritten. Sweat ran into his collar. "He's right." That was when the woman finally spoke again, softer now, though the softness did not weaken her. "Why did you choose me?" The question landed stranger than a slap. The crowd heard it too, because even the flies seemed to stop. Elias looked at her bound hands, then at the bruise under her jaw, then into her eyes. "Why wouldn't I?" For the first time, something moved in her face. Not gratitude. Not yet. Something rawer. Something like disbelief forced to stand upright. Grinn stepped closer, the smell of bay rum and old money drifting off him. "Careful, blacksmith. Mercy has a habit of costing more than $2. I know what things cost." Their eyes held. The heat between them felt hotter than the sun. Elias cut the rope at the woman's wrists with the small skinning knife he kept in his boot. Red welts rose where the fibers had bitten her. She did not rub them. She only lowered her hands and flexed her fingers once, as if reminding herself they still belonged to her. "What's your name?" Elias asked. "Mara." The name sat between them. He offered her his canteen. She took it, drank once, and handed it back without thanks. That almost made him respect her more. A murmur rolled through town as they stepped off the platform together. Some faces showed relief. Others showed fear. A few showed the mean excitement people get when trouble chooses a shape they can watch from a safe distance. Old Mrs. Holloway crossed herself from her boarding house porch. Sheriff Boone, standing in the shade beside the jail, touched 2 fingers to his mustache, and looked away like a man who knew the law had just lost a round and did not intend to admit it. Elias did not lead Mara toward the church or the boarding house where decent eyes could supervise. He led her straight to his forge at the edge of town, where the ringing of iron drowned gossip and the smoke from the chimney kept visitors short of breath. The forge sat beside a narrow house and a long barn silvered gray by weather. Wind pushed heat through the open smithy door, carrying the smell of coal, horse sweat, hot nails, and dry sage from the hills. Inside, tools hung in disciplined rows. Tongs, hammers, punches. The anvil crouched in the center like an altar for rough prayers. Mara stopped at the threshold. You always buy strangers and bring them home. I don't buy people. You paid for me. I paid to stop them. She studied him with the sharp caution of someone who had learned the space between those two things could still hide danger. Elias set the canteen down and brought a basin of cool water from the pump. Sit. She didn't. He poured anyway and laid out clean cloth, salve, and a small jar of bear grease. Suit yourself. At last she sat on an upturned crate, though she kept her boots planted as if ready to run. Elias knelt in front of her and reached for her wrists. She flinched so fast her heel scraped the floor. I'm tending rope burns, he said. Men say many things before they touch you. He held her gaze. Then I'll let my hands do the honest part. Slowly, she gave him one wrist. The skin was angry and raw. He washed it gently. Dirt and blood clouded the basin water. Under the redness, he saw a pale old scar circling her wrist, almost hidden by dust and sun-darkened skin, as if she had once worn iron there far longer than rope. His hand stilled. Mara noticed. What? Nothing. But it was not nothing. The scar looked like the mark left by army shackles, the kind transport wagons used years ago during border removals. He had seen those marks once and spent 10 winters trying not to. Before he could ask, a sound cracked across the yard. Not thunder. Not a splitboard. A rifle shot. The window behind the cot burst inward. Glass sprayed over the floor. Mara dropped sideways off the crate. Elias moved without thought, driving into her, covering her as a second shot punched through the door frame and buried itself in the far wall. Then came silence. Hard, listening silence. Outside, the wind dragged a loose chain against the barn with a thin metallic scrape. Elias reached for the shotgun above the workbench. Mara caught his sleeve. Her voice was barely breath. Don't go out the front. He looked down at her. She was staring at the broken window, not in panic, but with recognition. Real recognition. As if she knew who fired. As if this was not the beginning of trouble, but its arrival. From somewhere beyond the barn, a horse gave a sharp, frightened whinny. Mara swallowed once and said, If that man found me this fast, then he brought the others. Elias kept his hand on the shotgun. What others? Her eyes lifted to his, dark and steady in the dust-shot light. The men who killed my father, she said, and the one who's been looking for you. For one long beat, Elias heard nothing except the blood pushing in his ears and the faint hiss of coals dying in the forge. Then he moved. He crossed low to the back wall, unhooked the shotgun, and checked both barrels with a speed born from habit he wished he had forgotten. Mara was already up on one knee, a shard of window glass in her hand like a little knife. It would not do much against rifles, but the fact that she had armed herself instead of freezing told him more than any story could have. Backroom, he said. No, that wasn't a request. That wasn't random, she shot back. If they wanted me dead, they'd have fired through the walls until one bullet found me. They wanted to scare you first. Elias glanced toward the open loft above the barn passage. She was right, and he disliked her for it only because truth often came carrying more trouble than lies. He eased to the side window, keeping his shoulder against the wall, and stole a look through the cracked frame. Nothing in the yard except heat shimmering over the water trough and a scrap of cloth caught on the mesquite fence. No rider. No movement. No smoke from another rifle. He lowered himself again. Tell me. Mara wiped dust from her mouth with the back of her hand. My father kept records for men who couldn't read their own contracts. Herd shares. Freight tallies. Water claims. Folks trusted him because he wrote what was said, not what powerful men wished they'd said. Grinn. She nodded. 2 weeks ago, Father copied papers from Grinn's office after a card game. He thought they proved Grinn fenced spring water that didn't belong to him. Then he found more. Bribes. Fake liens. 3 names beside 3 dead men. One was my father's. The forge smelled suddenly bitter, like quenched iron. Elias knew that taste. It was what came when heat met old poison. Where are the papers? She hesitated. Safe. Safe where? Safe enough that I'm still breathing. He almost snapped at that, then stopped himself. Trust could not be demanded from a woman sold for dead at noon and shot at by sundown. Outside, a board creaked in the wind. Inside, the light had shifted golden and mean through the busted pane. You said someone was looking for me. Mara's face tightened. She reached slowly into the lining of her dress and pulled out a flat leather pouch no bigger than a palm. From it, she drew a tarnished cavalry button and set it in his hand. The eagle on the metal was worn nearly smooth. Elias knew it anyway. His breath shortened. My mother kept that, Mara said. She said it came from a soldier who cut her loose when the others burned the wagons. The forge shrank around him. He smelled smoke that wasn't there. Heard screams that had belonged to another season and another border. Saw a woman on her knees beside a burning cart, wrists raw from iron, an infant wrapped to her chest with a red blanket striped black. He remembered firing upward, not at her people but over their heads, buying seconds with mutiny disguised as confusion. He remembered his sergeant shouting. Remembered flames taking the canvas. Remembered leaving with blood on his sleeve and cowardice in his ribs because one man had not been enough to stop the rest. He closed his fist around the button until the edge bit skin. My mother said the soldier had a scar on his neck shaped like a fishhook. Mara's eyes lifted to the white line above his collar. She never knew his name. I heard it later from a drunk drover who'd once served under Silas Grinn. He said Grinn blamed a scout named Elias Vane for losing prisoners on the border. Said he'd settle that debt if he ever got the chance. The old guilt in Elias shifted into something colder. Not shame. Direction. A knock sounded at the side door, 3 measured taps. Both of them froze. Elias, Sheriff Boone called. If you're breathing in there, answer before I decide you ain't. Elias opened the door with the shotgun hidden behind his leg. Boone stepped in, broad-bellied and sunburned, hat in his hands. He took in the broken window, the glass on the floor, Mara's scraped wrists, and Elias's face. His own face turned tired in a hurry. Grinn says you stole contracted labor, Boone said. Grinn says many things, Elias answered. Boone sighed and rubbed his jaw. Town's nervous. Half of them owe him feed money. Other half owe him water. He's got 3 riders in from Red Basin already, and more coming by dark. Mara stood straight. He murdered my father. Boone looked at her, and for a second Elias saw the sheriff weighing truth against survival the way men in small towns always had to. Can you prove it? Not to you, she said. The sheriff glanced back to Elias. You planning to hand her over? The answer rose before caution could catch it. No. Boone closed his eyes briefly, as if a private prayer had just been denied. Then listen careful. I can slow Grinn, not stop him. If he claims you're obstructing a legal debt transfer and hiding evidence, he'll bring a circuit judge from Carson Creek and make it all look respectable. Since when does respectability ride with hired guns? Elias asked. Since folks got thirsty enough not to care. Boone set a ring of keys on the bench. There's a storage tunnel under the old jail that opens past the wash. I locked it years ago after a prisoner froze down there. If you mean to leave town before dark, use that. If you mean to stay and fight, at least choose where. He turned to go, then paused. Elias. What? Mercy's one thing. War is another. Elias looked at Mara's wrists, at the button in his own hand, at the sunlight glittering on broken glass. Sometimes they arrived together. After Boone left, the forge felt smaller than before. Mara watched Elias as he loaded shells into the shotgun stock and filled a canvas satchel with bandages, jerky, water, and horseshoe nails sharp enough to lame a chasing mount. You're leaving because of me, she said. I'm moving because Grinn fired first. You could still walk away. He strapped on his gun belt. Could you? That silenced her. He saddled 2 horses in the barn while swallows dipped through the rafters. The smell of hay and leather wrapped around the sharper scent of fear from the animals. Outside, clouds had begun stacking along the western ridge, dark at the bottom, copper lit at the top. Storm weather. Bad for travel. Good for hiding tracks. Mara emerged carrying the satchel he had packed and a short recurved bough from somewhere in the tack room. He lifted a brow. My father treated ranch horses, she said. Men forget what else he taught me because I let them. That, too, told him plenty. Before they mounted, Elias walked back into the forge. He took one last look at the anvil, the tongs, the half-finished plowshare cooling on the bench. A blacksmith's work was simple in the only way honest work can be. Heat, shape, quench, begin again. The world outside was never so clean. He reached under the hearthstone and drew out an oilskin packet he had not touched in 11 years. Inside lay his old scout map, a folded army discharge, and the silver badge Boone had once tried to pin on him after the war for saving men he could not remember and failing people he never could forget. He left the badge behind. When he stepped into the yard, Mara was already in the saddle. From the north road came the faint drumming of hoofbeats. Not one rider. Several. Mara turned her face toward the sound. The wind lifted loose strands of hair across her bruised cheek. Too late for the tunnel, she said. Elias mounted and looked toward the hills beyond town, where the dry wash cut into stone like an old scar. No, he said, tightening the reins. Too late to run blind. The hoofbeats grew louder. Dust rose beyond the cottonwoods in a hard brown plume. Mara drew an arrow and set it lightly to string. Elias cocked the shotgun across his saddle and pointed toward the ridge trail above the wash, the one only freight mules and hunted men ever used. If we're doing this, he said, we do it on ground I choose. They rode out behind the forge just as the first of Grinn's riders broke into the yard. Elias did not look back at once. He listened instead. A shouted order. The bang of a kicked gate. Horses snorting at the scent of powder. Then a rifle cracked, close enough that splinters leapt from the fence post beside his knee. Mara's mare flattened her ears and surged forward. Elias leaned low over his own horse's neck as they plunged into the wash. Dry hollow fell behind them in a blur of clabbered roofs, chimney smoke, and church bell silence. Ahead, the land broke open into gullies ribbed with shale, juniper, and pale stone that held the day's heat like banked coals. The storm clouds had thickened now, dragging shadow over the ridge, but the air below stayed hard and breathless. Dust coated Elias's tongue. Sweat crawled beneath his shirt. Every hoof strike sent a dull hammer through the narrow canyon. 3 behind, Mara called. Only 3. For if the one on the gray can still sit a saddle after he misses twice. Her voice carried something fierce and alive inside it. And despite the danger, Elias nearly smiled. He did not. Smiling in a chase could make a man careless, and carelessness had already cost him too much in one lifetime. The wash twisted left around a shelf of black rock. Elias knew this country from old freight runs. 1 mile ahead, the gully narrowed into a choke point where a wagon had overturned years ago and never been hauled out. If they reached it first, they might force the riders into single file. If a bullet sang past his ear, another slapped stone and burst in sparks. Elias wheeled in the saddle and fired one barrel backward without slowing. The blast boomed in the canyon, magnified into thunder. One horse screamed. A rider toppled sideways into dust and brush. The others checked just enough to give distance. Mara veered suddenly toward a ledge trail no wider than a coffin. This way. He trusted her before he had time to ask why. Their horses climbed, scrambling over loose rock. Below them, the wash floor dropped away in a steep runnel cluttered with boulders. Mara pointed with her chin toward a cut in the stone ahead where a thin trickle of water darkened the wall. Father and I camped there in summer, she said. There's a shelf above it. They reached the shelf seconds before the lead rider entered the bend below. Elias swung out of the saddle, grabbed the horse's reins, and pulled both animals behind scrub oak. Mara went prone at the edge, arrow knocked. The first rider looked up too late. Her shot took him clean through the shoulder. He spun off his horse with a cry that bounced from wall to wall. The second rider reined back, cursing. Elias fired the remaining barrel into the choke point, hitting stone inches from the horse's head. Animal panic did the rest. The mount reared, slammed into the rider behind it, and turned the canyon into a knot of flesh, leather, and chaos. For one breath, all was noise. Hooves hammering, men shouting, rocks skittering down the slope. Then a new sound cut through it. Slow clapping. Silas Grinn rode into view from the far bend as though arriving late to theater he had paid to enjoy. He sat a black gelding with a silver-trimmed saddle and carried no rifle, only a revolver resting easy across his thigh. Rain smell rolled before the storm now, sharp and metallic. Nicely chosen ground, Grinn called up. Still got a scout's eye, Vane. Elias felt Mara look at him, but he did not look back. You should have stayed a cattle buyer, Elias said. Grinn smiled up into the rocks. You should have finished what you started 12 years ago. The words struck with more force than the bullets. Mara stayed low, but Elias saw the tendons in her wrist tighten on the bowstring. Grinn lifted a hand, and one of the remaining riders dragged something from behind his saddle and tossed it onto the canyon floor. It rolled once and came to rest against a stone. Sheriff Boone's hat, dark with blood around the band. The world narrowed. He tried to block the north road, Grinn said mildly. Loyal in a foolish way. Much like you. Mara's whisper barely reached Elias. Don't. But grief had its own speed, and rage had always known the path to his trigger finger. Elias stepped from cover, shotgun empty in his hands, half meaning to use it as a club if he had to get close enough. Grinn was waiting for that. The shot came from the right, not below. A hidden rifleman on the opposite slope. The bullet tore through Elias's upper arm and spun him to one knee. Hot pain flashed white through his body. The canyon tilted. He heard Mara shout his name, as if from underwater. Then her bow thrummed twice. A man screamed above them. Rocks tumbled. The hidden rifle clattered down the wall. Mara was beside Elias in an instant, dragging him backward by his good shoulder. Move. He moved because she hauled him, and because staying still meant death. They stumbled toward the shelf spring, while bullets chipped the lip of rock behind them. Elias's wounded arm burned with each heartbeat. Blood slicked his sleeve and dripped from his fingertips onto the pale stone. At the water seam, Mara shoved him behind the wet rock face and tore open the satchel with her teeth. Press here. She jammed a folded cloth into his hand and clamped it over the wound. Rain began at last, sudden and cold, striking dust hard enough to release the smell of earth from months of thirst. Below, Grinn's men regrouped. We can't hold this, Mara said. There's a cut through, Elias managed, breath rough. Behind the spring. Narrow crawl. Leads to the upper mesa. How do you know? I used it once. For what? He met her eyes. Running. She stared a beat, then nodded as if filing the answer for later. She crawled into the crack first, bow on her back, shoulders scraping stone. Elias followed, biting down a groan as the wound caught against rock. Behind them, Grinn called into the rain. She knows what's in the ledger, Vane. But you know what's in my graveyard. Bring her down, and maybe I let you keep breathing long enough to regret it. They emerged onto the mesa in wind and rain so hard it flattened the sage. Lightning split the sky over Dry Hollow, white and violet. For a moment the whole basin flashed below them. Town roofs, the black stripe of the road, cattle scattered like dropped nails, and Grinn's riders circling in the canyon mouth. Mara pulled Elias toward a cluster of basalt boulders. There she stripped his shirt sleeve with the knife, revealing the wound. Clean through the meat of the arm, not shattered bone. Lucky in the way gunshots can be lucky without mercy. She poured whiskey over it. Elias cursed through clenched teeth. Good, she said. You're conscious. Rain ran off her lashes. Blood from Boone's hat had somehow splashed her cheek, leaving a dark streak like war paint she had never asked to wear. While she bound the wound, Elias forced himself to think past pain. Grinn had killed Boone. Grinn had followed them with knowledge only an old army man would have. Where to pin, how to flank, when anger could be used like bait. That meant the ledger alone was not the true danger. The past was. Mara, he said. She tied the bandage hard. What? Your mother? Was her name Sonny? Her hand stopped. Yes. The storm seemed to lean closer. Elias swallowed rain. I remember her. Mara's face changed, not into trust. Not yet, but into something more dangerous. Hope, trying not to be foolish. Below them, Grinn's voice rose through thunder. I know where the papers are, girl. And if you make me come to town empty-handed, I'll burn every roof between the church and the graveyard. Mara looked toward Dry Hollow, where thin smoke already curled from somewhere near the livery. Then she looked back at Elias, eyes black with rain and fury. He's lying about the papers, she said. But he'll burn the town anyway. Elias pushed himself to his feet, pale from blood loss and shaking with effort. Then we stop him in town, he said. A lightning flash showed Grinn below, staring up as if he had heard. And when the thunder passed, Mara said the one thing Elias had feared more than the wound. The ledger is hidden under your forge. For a moment, the storm erased everything except the sound of rain striking rock. Elias stood still under it, one hand pressed to the boulder, the other hanging useless and blood-heavy at his side. Under my forge, he repeated. Mara nodded once. My father hid it there the night before he died. He said no one would search a blacksmith's hearth because men like Grinn never notice the hands that keep their wagons moving. And you waited till now to tell me. I waited until I knew whether you were helping me or collecting me. The honesty in that landed cleaner than any apology. Wind drove Rain sideways across the mesa. They limped toward a lined shack tucked beneath the ridge, an abandoned sheep camp Elias remembered from freight days. The roof listed, but the walls still held. Inside, it smelled of wet cedar, mouse droppings, and old smoke. Mara kicked the door shut, set a broken chair under the latch, and knelt by a cold hearth to strike a tinder spark from Elias's kit. Soon a small fire licked up through twisted sage root. Light moved over the rough walls and over Mara's face, softening nothing, only making the exhaustion visible. Elias sank onto a blanket roll left by some forgotten herder. His wounded arm throbbed in time with the rain. Mara crouched in front of him with needle, thread, and more whiskey. Shirt off. He gave her a look. She lifted a brow. You can bleed to death with modesty if you like. He pulled the shirt down his good arm and let it fall. The room chilled him at once. Old scars crossed his chest and shoulder, some white and clean, others knotted and ugly. Mara took them in with one brief glance and no comment. That restraint felt kinder than pity. She cleaned the wound again, then stitched where the skin gaped worst. Her hands were steady. Only the pulse beating in her throat betrayed strain. Firelight flashed on a thin, beaded bracelet at her wrist, half hidden beneath her sleeve, blue and white with one red stone sewn crooked at the center. Elias watched it while she worked. Your mother made that. She did. I remember the pattern. Mara tied off the stitch and sat back slowly. Tell me. He had spent years avoiding the shape of that command. Now, in a storm-shaken shack with blood drying on his skin and a woman he barely knew wearing the proof of an old failure, there was no room left to run. We were transporting prisoners south, he said. Not raiders. Families. Women. 2 old men. 3 children. Army called it relocation because decent words make ugly orders easier to swallow. He stared into the fire until the flames blurred. Sonny was among them. Your father, too, though I didn't know his name then. He'd been beaten for trying to cut the others loose. Grinn commanded the detail. Night we camped near Blackwash. He decided he was done feeding mouths that slowed the column. Mara did not move. He ordered the wagons fired. Said smoke would cover what happened. Said if any of us spoke different later, he'd swear the prisoners rushed us in the dark. Elias swallowed. The whiskey smell on his own skin turned sour. I cut too loose. Your mother and a boy. I tried for more. Gunfire started. Horses broke. Canvas went up like oil. When the firing stopped, Grinn counted bodies and told the report his way. I walked away with a discharge and a medal I never wore. Rain tapped the roof in slower, gentler beats now. Mara's voice came small, but not weak. My mother told me a soldier carried me out under his coat. Elias looked up. She said he put me in my father's arms and told them to keep west until the river bent north. Mara touched the red stone in her bracelet. She said he looked ashamed to still be alive. The fire cracked softly. Outside, thunder rolled farther away. I didn't know if you were that man, she went on. Not until I saw the scar on your neck and the way you looked at my wrists. Father knew your name from an old supply list he stole months later. He said if Grinn ever came again, the only man he might fear was the one who disobeyed him once and survived. Elias let out a breath that felt older than his lungs. Fear's not what kept me alive. No, Mara's mouth trembled at one corner. Almost a smile, almost grief. Maybe regret. She rose, crossed to her satchel, and took out the leather pouch. From it she withdrew a folded packet wrapped in oilskin, no bigger than a Bible. There isn't only one ledger, she said. The copy under your forge proves water theft and the false debts. This one proves the killings at Black Washington. Father got it from a clerk Grinn sheeted in Carson Creek. Names, dates, army allotments, burial payments for people never buried. Elias stared at it, as if it might burn through her hand. You carried that through the auction? He asked. I carried it while they tied me. She stepped closer and placed the packet in his good hand. Now we both have something to lose. He nodded. But the movement meant more than agreement. The room had changed. Not because danger was gone. It wasn't. Grinn would be moving on the forge by now, maybe the whole town. But the lie Elias had lived inside for 12 years had cracked, and through the break came something he had not let himself want. Witness. Mara sat beside him on the blanket, not touching it first. Firelight painted amber on the wet strands of her hair. He noticed a split seam at her shoulder, mud on the hem of her dress. The way fatigue made her blink slower now that stillness had permission to exist. "Why did you stay in Dry Hollow?" she asked quietly. He thought about answering with something easy. Work. Distance. Habit. Instead he said, "Because iron listens when men won't. You heat it, strike true, and the shape tells the truth of your hands. I needed something in the world that didn't lie for powerful men." Mara absorbed that. Then, after a pause, she leaned her shoulder lightly against his uninjured one. It was a small contact. Almost nothing. It hit him harder than the bullet. "My father used to say horses trust the hand that doesn't hurry them," she murmured. "Maybe people do too." He looked at her. "You trust me. Enough to go back." That was not romance. Not yet. It was rarer. Earned ground. Elias opened the oilskin packet. Inside lay pages spotted with age and damp, tied with faded cord. On top sat a child's carved horse no longer than a finger, made from mesquite root and polished smooth by many thumbs. He knew it at once. "I carved this," he said, astonished. Mara's face softened. "My mother kept it beside her bed until she died." He turned the tiny horse in his palm, thumb passing over knife marks from a younger hand. Proof that one decent act, however incomplete, had not vanished into ash. Proof that mercy could survive memory. The storm eased to a whisper. Through a crack in the wall, dawn's first pale hint touched the eastern sky. Mara stood. "If Grinn reaches the forge before us, he'll find the ledger. He'll search the hearth. He'll also expect us to come there desperate." She strapped on the bow and checked her arrows. "So we won't come desperate." Elias rose more slowly, pain pulling at the fresh stitches in his arm. He tucked the black wash packet inside his vest and slipped the carved horse into his pocket. Then he buckled on his revolver. "What's the plan?" Mara asked. He looked at the coming light, thin as blade steel. "We let Grinn gather everyone in one place. Men like him can't resist an audience. And when he has one..." Elias's gaze hardened, but not into vengeance alone. Into purpose. "Then we make the whole town hear what he's spent years burying." Outside, wet sage breathed clean after rain, and somewhere below the ridge a hawk cried into the brightening dark. By the time Elias and Mara reached the edge of Dry Hollow, smoke was already drifting over town in low gray bands. Not the thick wild smoke of a full fire. Warning smoke. Controlled and cruel. A stable burned at one end of the street, just enough to frighten men into buckets and women into prayer, while Grinn arranged the rest. Riders stood at both roads. Folks had been driven toward the square between the church and the mercantile, where the auction platform still stood like an insult left overnight. "Just as you said," Mara whispered from behind the rain-dark cottonwoods. He wanted witnesses. Grinn stood on the platform with one boot on a crate and a rifle across his arms, the pale suit exchanged for a dark coat, still neat despite storm mud. Beside him, two men held old Mrs. Holloway and the livery boy, Tomas, by the shoulders. The clerk who had accepted Elias's $2 stood near the church steps, face white as flour. Half the town watched in silence. Half looked away, and hanging from the forge chimney where every eye could see it was Boone's badge, nailed through the center. Something in Elias wanted to go hot and blind. Instead, he breathed once, deep and slow, as if drawing air at the anvil before the hammer fell. Mara touched his wrist. "Remember your choice." He looked at her. Not kill or spare. Not fight or hide. Truth or vengeance. He nodded. They moved fast. Around the back of the mercantile. Through Ruth Holloway's garden patch ruined by ash. Past the church shed where old lantern oil was kept. Elias slipped behind his forge first. The back door hung open. Someone had searched the place hard. Tools lay scattered. The workbench overturned. Hearthstones pried loose. But not all of them. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the stab in his arm, and drove a chisel under the flat stone at the rear corner of the firebox. It lifted. Beneath sat a narrow tin box wrapped in soot-black cloth. Still there. He looked over his shoulder. Mara had already climbed the hayloft ladder and was cutting free the bell rope that ran from the church tower to the volunteer fire wagon. Clever. If pulled from the loft window, it would ring the church bell wild and sudden, the town's old signal for flood or attack. Elias took the tin box and stepped back out into the yard. Grinn's voice rolled across the square. Bring the girl to me, and no more buildings burn. Keep hiding her, and I start with the boarding house. Ruth Holloway spat toward the platform. One of the riders jerked her back so hard she gasped. Elias walked into the open street. Heads turned. A murmur spread like wind through dry grass. Grinn smiled. There he is. I was beginning to think guilt had improved your judgment. Elias stopped 10 paces from the platform. Soot marked his shirt. Blood had dried down one side. He held the tin box in his good hand where everyone could see it. You want your papers? He said. Come take them. Mara appeared above them in the loft window of the forge, bow drawn, arrow aimed straight at Grinn's throat. The square tightened like a drawn wire. One of Grinn's riders raised a rifle toward her. Elias fired first. His revolver bucked once. The rider's gun spun from his hand and clattered into the dirt. Instantly, the square exploded with shouts. Horses reared. Women ducked. Men scattered for barrels and troughs. Then the church bell began to scream. Mara yanked the fire rope with all her weight. The bell crashed over the town, huge and urgent, and every buried instinct in Dry Hollow answered. Folks moved not as spectators now, but as a town under threat. Tomas tore free and kicked a rider's shin. Ruth Holloway snatched a bucket pole and cracked it across another man's wrist. The clerk scrambled onto the church steps and shouted, voice cracking. He falsified the liens. I seen the ink. I seen it. Grinn swung his rifle toward Mara. Elias fired again. The shot hit the platform rail beside Grinn's hand, splintering wood, forcing the barrel aside just as Mara loosed. Her arrow drove through Grinn's coat sleeve and pinned him to the post behind him. The town gasped as one body. Still, Grinn did not fall. He ripped free with a snarl, drew his revolver, and aimed not at Elias now, but at old Mrs. Holloway, the easiest hostage within reach. That was the final shape of him. Not a cattle king, not a lawman once. Just a man who turned weakness into leverage because he could not rule any other way. Elias could have killed him then. The line was clear enough. Chest, throat, head. Years of rage begged for it. Instead, he did the harder thing. He holstered the gun. Grinn blinked, wrong-footed for the first time in memory. Listen to me, Elias said, voice carrying over the bell, over smoke, over fear. This man ordered prisoners burned at Blackwash 12 years ago. Women, children, old men. He stole their allotment money, then stole water here the same way. The proofs are in this box and in the packet inside my vest. If I die, Mara Reed carries the names. If she dies, the clerk knows where copies go. You can shoot one of us, Silas. Maybe both. But today you lose the lie. He tossed the tin box into the center of the street. Papers spilled in the dust. For a second, no one moved. Then Sheriff Boone's deputy, a skinny man named Calder who had spent most of his life agreeing with louder voices, stepped out from beside the jail and picked up the top sheet. His eyes moved. His face changed. He looked at Boone's bloodied hat nailed to the forge, and something in him found a spine. In the name of territorial law, Calder said, not loudly but clearly, I'm taking custody of those records. Grinn laughed once, ugly and unbelieving. You? Calder swallowed. And of you? Silas Grinn fired. But not fast enough. Mara's second arrow struck his gun hand at the same instant. Tomas flung a bucket of trough water into his face from below. The shot went wild. Elias lunged as Grinn stumbled from the platform. They hit the dirt together hard enough to drive air from both lungs. Pain tore through Elias's wounded arm. Grinn clawed for the dropped revolver. Elias caught his wrist, slammed it against the wagon wheel, and heard bone crack. Grinn howled and reached for Elias's throat with the other hand. They rolled in dust and spilled papers and muddy blood while the bell roared above them. Grinn was older but heavier, full of the dense strength of a man accustomed to taking. Elias drove a knee into his ribs, took an elbow to the mouth, tasted iron, saw the revolver lying inches from Grinn's fingertips. He could still kill him. Instead, Elias seized Grinn by the collar, dragged him upright in front of the whole square, and forced the man's wounded hand down onto Boone's badge where it hung nailed to the forge. You want a witness? Elias said through blood. Look around. All around them. Townspeople had stopped hiding. Ruth Holloway stood with the bucket pole across her shoulders like a rifle. The clerk held 3 sheets high with shaking hands. Calder cocked Boone's shotgun. Tomas stood beside Mara beneath the loft, chin lifted. Faces Elias had known for years looked not away now, but straight at the truth. Grinn saw it. Saw the obedience leaving. His struggle changed. Not fiercer. Smaller. That was when he lost. Calder stepped forward and clapped Boone's irons around Grinn's unbroken wrist. "Silas Grinn," he said, louder this time. "You are under arrest for murder, fraud, and the killing of Sheriff Boone." No one argued. No rider fired. One by one, Grinn's men lowered their weapons. Men who served power for money seldom bled for it when the crowd stopped believing. The rest unfolded with the rough dignity of earned justice. The papers were read in the church under armed watch. Names matched graves. Debts dissolved. Water claims reversed. By sunset, Grinn sat in Boone's own cell with his fine coat torn and his silence worth less than dust. Boone was buried the next day on the hill above town, with the badge mended and laid on the lid of his coffin. 3 weeks later, travelers passing Dry Hollow would have seen a rebuilt stable, a new deputy trying to sit straighter than fear, and Mara Reed standing beside the forge doorway with sleeves rolled, sorting medicine herbs while Elias hammered hot iron into shape. Sometimes she worked the bellows. Sometimes she argued with him about horses. Sometimes, near evening, they said nothing at all. Once, as the sun sank copper over the ridge, she touched the carved horse he had hung above the shop door and asked, quieter now, "Why did you choose me?" Elias looked at her, at the town breathing easier around them, at the life neither of them had expected to keep. "Because mercy isn't ownership," he said. "It's recognition." Years later, children in Dry Hollow would learn their sums in a small schoolroom built where the auction platform used to stand. Above the forge beam beside the door, 2 names were carved into the wood so deep weather could never take them. Boone, for the law that finally stood up, and Sonny, for the fire that truth outlived. And when evening settled over the valley and the last light burned red along the anvil's edge, Mara and Elias would stand in the doorway together, watching the road fade gold into dusk, while the clean sound of the hammer carried across town like a promise that had finally kept its word.